Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. Today's space will be discussing the mostly prehistory of northeastern Europe, as well as parts of northern Asia, and the origin of the Uralic peoples. To understand where all these peoples came from, I'm going to try to go back to the very beginning, the migration out of Africa. Then I'll go over how we know about these different peoples, their origins, how we can identify them, and to what accuracy or I guess to the ability that we can identify them. So way back, perhaps 70,000 years ago, most of the ancestors of the peoples of Eurasia, as well as the Americas and Australasia, left Africa in either one migration or more likely several migrations, and they spread across the world. There's a lot of unknowns. There was definitely a lot of very strange migrations going on. For instance, the oldest sample we have from Europe that's a modern human that we've been able to DNA sequence was found in Bulgaria and is actually that group of people, his kind of population, don't exist, and they're more closely related to peoples of East Asia than anyone in Western Eurasia. So there's a lot of weird stuff like that going on in the last ice age. Now, for northern Europe, a lot of it was covered in glaciers, and those extended all the way into Asia as well. And there were what are called refugias, where there were populations that could survive, like even with the glaciation during the ice age. Some of these, there were some areas that were completely blocked off. The Caucasus Mountains, for instance, all the mountain passes were frozen over. There wasn't really any, crossing of the Caucasus at that point. And similarly, all the way over in kind of Northeast Asia, Siberia, you had a lot of those mountain passes that would connect what's modern-day China to what's modern-day Siberia were kind of blocked off. So you had this population called the ancestral North Eurasians. And the samples we have from them, they're, kind of in central Siberia around Irkutsk, Novosibirsk, on the Yenisei rivers. And I believe they probably were kind of an extreme population, and their kind of base was more in Central Asia, perhaps around Lake Balkhash and the Amu Darya Basin. That's kind of modern day eastern Kazakhstan as well as Uzbekistan. Now, the ancestral North Eurasians, they play a huge role in a lot of the populations we'll be discussing today. They contribute about 75% of the ancestry of people called the Eastern Hunter-Gatherers, who will play a major role in the recolonization of kind of northern Russia after the end of the last ice age. So these Eastern hunter-gatherers, once the glaciers start to retreat, things start to warm up. These Eastern hunter-gatherers move in to northern Russia, and all the way into the Baltic and Scandinavia and Ukraine as well. And they're met there by a group of people called the Western hunter-gatherers who had survived possibly in Italy, Spain, the Balkans, similar areas, kind of in southern Europe, where it was a lot warmer than, northern Europe in the Ice Age was frozen over. And their mixing produced a few different groups. There was one group called the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, and they were formed from kind of a mix of these Eastern hunter-gatherers and these Western hunter-gatherers in, kind of Sweden, Norway area. Similarly, you have groups in Ukraine and the Baltic, that are very similar to these. Now, further east, you have in Siberia, you have, going back to the last ice age again, you have this huge thing called Lake Mansi, which was this major lake in western Siberia. There are glaciers and everything as well. And as these retreat, there were similar groups that repopulated it. However, they were not the Eastern hunter-gatherers. They were actually fairly distinctive. It's difficult to get a good idea on who they were, but at least one of these groups would go and spoke a very, very early version of what would be called Proto-Uralic, the language spoken by the Uralic peoples. Now, what is Uralic? So, most of the languages in Europe are of the Indo-European branch, or the Indo-European language family. So that's German, Russian, English, Spanish, Romanian, Polish. Those are all Indo-European languages. Uh, there are some exceptions. There's the Basque language, which is a language isolate, and it was either a Western hunter-gatherer language or it was a early European farmer (EEF) language. It's hard to say, and that's spoken in kind of southwestern France and northern Spain. And then you have the Semitic languages related to Hebrew and Arabic, which are spoken in Malta. And then you have the Uralic languages, Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian are all spoken by their nationalities, the Finns, the Estonians, and the Hungarians. And there's also a number of Uralic minority languages within Russia, both west of the Urals and east of the Urals. The largest ones are Udmurt, Komi, and Mari. You also have Naganisan, Nenets, and Selkup, as well as a few other ones. And there used to be quite a bit more. A lot of these peoples have gotten absorbed into the Russian population, and the languages are either moribund or extinct. And I believe Latvia, I'm not sure if the language is still spoken. There used to be a language called Livonian, which was also a Uralic language spoken, again related to Estonian. So where do these peoples come from? How did they kind of spread all over? And that's what I'll be trying to answer today. So the big group we have kind of the groups in Western Siberia, and they do share links with the peoples of East Asia as well as the Amerindians. How this happened, it's uncertain. What we do see is kind of in Siberia, there's a huge amount of ancestry, what we would call East Asian colloquially, that came out of East Asia or possibly the Amur River Basin, in Manchuria, that actually spread into kind of Western and Central Siberia, at the end of the last ice age. It's not known when exactly this took place. I believe we know it had not taken place by 16,000 BC, but it had by 4,000 BC. So it's a pretty big time frame that this kind of East Asian migration into Siberia had happened, and you do have these kind of mixed populations where they're a mix of that ancestral North Eurasian population, the A&E population, as well as the kind of East Asian component that we see. And there are a lot of different groups that kind of came out of this mixing in that 12,000 year period. You have the two groups that would go on to settle the Americas. One of which, and I'll probably be going on this on a different topic, accounts for some weird ancestry you have in the South American Amerindians. So you have these two groups that go off to America, and they're related, but they're not identical, and that's why you do get some strange results. Another one of these groups would eventually, they spoke the Proto-Dene-Yenesan language. So there's a language called Ket that's spoken or used to be spoken in the Yenisei River in central Siberia. And you also have the famous Navajo and Apache languages of the American Southwest, and they're actually related to each other, going back thousands and thousands of years. There was a second migration, perhaps around 2800 BC, associated with kind of the speakers of those Dene-Yenisei languages across the Bering Strait in the Americas, and then eventually, in the historical period, actually, probably around 1400, those people migrated south from the far north of North America all the way into the American Southwest. It's kind of out of this cauldron, I want to say, and it's not really fair because these events took place for thousands and thousands of years. And this definitely would have happened at some point before 6000 BC. The ancestors of the Proto-Uralic peoples had spread west, kind of out of the Lake Baikal area. They had relatively more of the ancestral North Eurasian ancestry than the East Asian ancestry, and they would have settled somewhere perhaps near the Minnesisk Basin or on the Ob and Irtysh River Basin. My guess is now by probably 4000 BC, I'm pretty sure that they were in the Ob Irtysh Basin. So that's kind of, near modern Omsk, maybe a bit east of Chelyabinsk if you go and look at a map, Surgut, that kind of area. Um, Now we actually do have a sample. His name is Kra001, and he was found in Krasnoyarsk Oblast in Russia. Um, so around the closer to the Minsk Basin area, so a bit further east from my guess for a Proto-Uralic homeland. And Kra001 is kind of interesting because he was dated to the late 5th millennium BC. And this is, there's a lot of guesses for when Proto-Uralic was spoken. Proto-Uralic is the last common ancestor of all the Uralic languages. There's some people that say Proto-Uralic was spoken as early as 6000 BC. There's some people who claim it was spoken as late as 2000 BC. My guess is it was probably closer to 3000 BC for a variety of reasons. So I think this guy was kind of a pre-Proto-Uralic speaker when they were still in the Minsk Basin, and they eventually ended up in the Ob-Irtish. Another possibility is this guy was a speaker of kind of Para-Uralic. That is, his language was related to Proto-Uralic, but it's died off completely in the years since then, whether because they've been destroyed or admixed into another group. Or simply went extinct for another reason. So it's possible Kra001, he's from a sister lineage. And he's very interesting for several reasons. So one, he's in the Minsk Basin, which is one of the theories for the Proto-Uralic Heimat, the original home of the Uralic peoples. The other one is he's a bearer of a Y chromosome, and they keep on changing the Y chromosome names. It used to be called N1C, and it's very, very associated with the Uralic peoples. The peoples who speak the Uralic languages have rates, they're men at least, have rates of N1C much, much higher than other peoples. A lot of Russians have it too, since the Russians have mixed fairly extensively with the Uralic peoples within the historical period. And he also when a lot of geneticists were trying to model the expansion of the Uralic people in years past, they used to use the Naganissan people. They're a Uralic people of the far north on the Taimyr Peninsula in far northern Siberian Russia. And the fits weren't that great, and Kra001 actually works better. I mean, it's not a perfect fit for the Uralic expansion by any means, but he does work pretty well. So he is, to our knowledge, the first Uralic-like guy that we have the record for, so maybe 4250 BC. Now, what linguists can do is they'll recreate proto-languages for, they'll compare, like for Indo-European, it was a Welshman who I believe noticed the similarities between Latin and Sanskrit, and that's how he realized that the languages of Europe and India were actually linked to each other, the Indo-European language families. It's similar for the Uralic languages. There's people who compare the Sami languages of the far north, Norway, Finland. You have Finnish, Hungarian, the Naganissan people, of course, the Udmurts, the Mari, and they compare these languages. They look, they've got all sorts of ingenious ways of figuring out how the sounds and the words change over times, and they can trace these back to kind of a shared proto-language, and they can rebuild the vocabulary, at least partially, of this proto-language based off the word sharing. From what we know from Proto-Uralic is they were a Mesolithic people. That is, they had stone tools, they had skis, they could fish, or they knew what fish were at least. They were far from the sea, and one of the key things is they had a word for the Siberian cedar. It's not a cedar, that's just what it's called in Russian at least. We would not consider this a cedar tree in the United States. And the cedar tree, it's only found east of the Urals, actually. It's not found west of the Urals. And that's another argument that the, Uralicists, a person who studies the Uralic peoples, uses to argue that the Uralic peoples originated east of the Ural Mountains rather than west. And that's where, and that comes important for who were the Uralics? Were they these eastern hunter-gatherers that were repopulating northern Russia after the end of the last ice age, or were they these peoples in kind of western Siberia, in the Ob-Irtysh River basin? The Ob and the Irtysh are two major rivers in western Siberia, just east of the Ural Mountains. And I think between CRA-001 and between the Proto-Uralic language having words that refer to a Siberian rather than a European environment, I think we can conclude that the Proto-Uralic peoples were indeed in Siberia and not in Europe. They were not the Eastern hunter-gatherers. They were this group of people who CRA-001 was related to. Being a Mesolithic people, they were, fairly primitive by our standards and also by the standards of the Bronze Age. They did have contacts, very intensive and very early on, with the Indo-European peoples of the Western Pontic steppe. Now, the Indo-Europeans, they might not be the people who invented horse riding, but they were definitely the earliest and most successful adopters of it, for sure. They did reach into kind of the southern Ural Mountains area, and this is where I believe they did come in contact with the Uralic peoples, perhaps for trade. Because we do know that the Indo-Europeans did trade with people. I'm not sure about the Uralics specifically, but they definitely had contacts with the their neighbors to the south and to the west as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if they had contacts with the Uralic peoples as well. And their settlement in the southern Urals, it's called Kargali, was actually in my opinion, the most important Indo-European site that we have. It was a copper mine. And, over the course of the Bronze Age, there were just thousands and thousands of tons of copper that were mined out of this mine. And they're using very primitive, by our estimation, tools to get all this copper out. But that copper would have given them a tremendous advantage over all of their many enemies and neighbors. And in my opinion, this was the actual cause for the Indo-European expansion, not a pandemic. The Indo-Europeans end up going and they conquer a huge area. Kind of the 1700-year period between 2900 BC and 1200 BC. They conquer northern India, Central Asia, as well as pretty much all of Europe and parts of the Caucasus Mountains too. Now, the Uralic peoples, they go and you start to see, it's hard to say early on. You do have the, it's called the comb ceramic culture, is one of the big cultures in kind of northern Europe. It was an EHG culture for the most part, even though once you get to the Baltic, a lot of the people there had a lot of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. And the Eastern hunter-gatherers, they actually had trade routes that connected, all the way from the far northern Pechora River, which is, in far northern Russia. And they actually had that connected by kind of a circumpolar trade route. They had trade, kind of along the Arctic Sea coast that went all the way to the Baltic. And that's even in the 5th millennium BC, interestingly enough. So you have these very, very old trade routes. And unfortunately, a lot of these, I'm going to be doing some more reading because a lot of this stuff, unfortunately, hasn't really been translated into English yet. A lot of it's from old Soviet archaeology. These Eastern hunter-gatherers, these comb ceramic people, actually did have contacts with the people of Western Siberia. There are some evidence of comb ceramic goods in the Ob-Irtysh River basin, perhaps in the late 4th millennium. And again, this is old Soviet stuff, so unfortunately it's with stratigraphy. They were looking at kind of the layers of soil that these artifacts were buried in. They weren't doing radiocarbon dating on them. And sometimes radiocarbon, it does have its issues, especially in watery areas, but, from my reading, it's much better than stratigraphy for sure, for a variety of reasons. Because I assume there's always going to be differences in sedimentation rates in different areas. It's possible this could have, with anything, humans are going to, intermarry with each other. It's possible that even very early on, you have these Eastern hunter-gatherers intermarrying with the kind of Proto-Uralic speakers that you have in the Ob-Irtish River Basin. I don't think it was that much. Even I believe if you look at kind of the most conservative, peoples of Western Siberia, they don't really have that much Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry, and it could very well be a modeling error. It might have been pure cultural adoption rather than any kind of, or trade, rather than any kind of, admixture. But it definitely was not a population replacement from the samples we have. At least not in the, areas we've sampled. So going kind of forward in time, back into the third millennium, the Uralic peoples actually have some advantages. Since you have some of them, or perhaps in the Miniscus Basin, they're near the Cyan and Altai Mountains, which become very, very important in the Middle Bronze Age. Why is that? So the early forms, bronze, the base of bronze is copper, and the early forms of bronze that the Indo-Europeans like to use are called arsenical bronze. That is, there were coppers with arsenic mixed in. And they actually weren't that great. I mean, they would have been an advantage over anything that anyone else had for sure. But they're not really a match for the tin bronzes, which would come out of the Altai and the Cyan Mountains. And what's very interesting is you have these Indo-European groups that had expanded, and the Indo-European groups that were in these areas had the Cyans and the Altai Mountains, because they're connected by the Eurasian steppe. It's this very flat area that horsemen, cart riders, that sort of thing, are able to settle in. You have, they spread all the way to Western Mongolia, actually, so they have them in the Altai and Cyan Mountains as well. And interestingly, there are signs in the Samitic languages of contact, at least one linguist has argued, with the Tocharian languages or Toharian languages. And the Toharians were a Indo-European people that had split off from the other Indo-Europeans several hundred years before kind of their main conquests went on. And, it's a very interesting kind of, I'm not a linguist, I'm not really able to quantify, but it is interesting that you have these kind of Toharian and Samietic influences on each other, at least at the proto-language level, what one linguist argues. And from the genetics, we know that the Indo-Europeans in the area, whereas in Europe they did tend to, destroy a lot of their enemies and, admix, take local brides. In the East, we don't really see that kind of population replacement. The Indo-Europeans were instead absorbed into the local populations. The locals were either able to defeat them and absorb them, or the Indo-Europeans kind of set themselves up as chieftains of these tribes and then got absorbed into their superior numbers. It's really hard to say, since of course we don't have any records for these guys. So you do see the peoples of the Cyans, of the Altai, of Western Mongolia. They're adopting a lot of these kind of better Indo-European methods of doing things, and they end up surpassing the Indo-Europeans in what's called the Seima-Turbino Phenomenon. So the Seima-Turbino people probably originated, in this Miniscus Basin, around the Cyan and Altai Mountains, and you'd think it would be a pretty primitive area, just given how remote it is from everything. The climate isn't good now, and it certainly wasn't great then. But they did have the advantage of access to tin, and with this tin, they were able to develop a very sophisticated weaponry, the best, at least in kind of the western half of Eurasia, for sure. I'm not an expert in East Asia, of course. And it actually spread. You have this kind of tin road that's going on. They, through the forest cultures of, Siberia, and they spread their technology and their metals, all the way to Europe. And this is, perhaps 2200 to maybe 1700 BC, so what's called the Middle Bronze Age. And I believe the Seima-Turbino phenomenon is actually associated with the earliest migrations of the Uralic peoples. I don't believe they were the sole people who were part of the Seima-Turbino. I believe it was several groups that had kind of connected together in a trade route, and I'm sure there were, conflicts within this and trade disruptions. But they did have this kind of shared forest, culture thing where they did have, know how to use these metallurgies. Um, and kind of spread these, tools around with their trade partners, as well as presumably conquer their neighbors, given that they had a superior technology. Um, at the time, the Indo-Europeans had destroyed a lot of their neighbors, to the north, to the west, to the south, and to the east by this time. There were still remnants of the eastern hunter-gatherers all the way up in the Petroa River Basin, and I think they'll actually be fairly important. Similarly, in Scandinavia, the Indo-Europeans had invaded and destroyed the natives, or I should say the predecessors, since neither of the groups were really native. Um, and you have the remnants of those cultures called the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, who actually survived in the very, very far north, all the way on the island of, I can't remember what the island's name was, but it's in the Tromsø. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. My Scandinavian followers can correct me. All the way up kind of far in northern Norway. So you have these, they're called the circumpolar cultures, the cultures very, very far to the north that actually do survive this Indo-European invasion, presumably for ecological reasons. The Indo-Europeans, even though by the late third millennium BC, kind of like the 2200s or so, even though they did have fairly advanced sailing by the standards of I think they were the most advanced sailors by 2200 BC. They didn't really have the kind of Arctic toolkit that a lot of these far northern peoples would have had. They were very much based in by that point, they had adopted kind of a mixed agropastoralism in a lot of areas, even if some of the Indo-Europeans, especially further east, did more stay as kind of almost pure herders, where they would herd their animals around. Anyhow, the far north wasn't hospitable for that kind of lifestyle. It's just too cold. You can't grow crops, your animals die in the winters, that kind of thing. So that's why you have kind of these two remnant peoples, the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers and the Eastern hunter-gatherers, that survived just hundreds and hundreds of years after their neighbors to the south had been destroyed in the Indo-European kind of invasion. And this is where the Sami come in. So around, 2200 BC, it's kind of a century of cataclysms all over the world. You have these things called the Bond events, which would happen every few hundred years. And every time in prehistory there's a Bond event and you have these kind of climactic shifts, you see these massive changes in cultures, these migrations everywhere. And 2200 BC was one of those. I believe it marks the end of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. You see you see a second wave of Indo-European invasions. There's all the stuff in the Middle East that goes on that, some of you guys who know a lot more about that than me can comment. You also see, a lot of stuff going on in the very far north of Eurasia as well. The ancestors of a people called, the Yukagir, or possibly the Chukchi people, and these are tribes of the very, very far north, and they still exist actually. You can go and meet them. And, they're in Russia as well. They go and they expand to the east and as well as the west, and kind of on the Yenisei River, that's a river in Siberia. They go and they contact some of the Uralic peoples, like the Naganosans. Naganosans, I believe, are kind of a mixed people, with origins from, both the Uralic peoples as well as the, kind of Yukagir or Chukdo-Kamachkin peoples. And you have this kind of new Arctic toolkit that makes their lifestyle more efficient than other people's. So even if it didn't necessarily give them like an immediate advantage as far as being able to destroy their enemies, it did whatever they did adopt. And there are certain tools and or not really tools, but kind of cultural like clothing, pottery type items, we can see that these peoples of the far north adopted in this kind of 500-year span between, maybe 2200 BC and 1700 BC. And the kind of new Arctic toolkit that they had that was accompanied by these new items that we can identify, enabled them to replace a lot of the peoples of northern Eurasia. You have the Dene-Yenisei speakers of Chukotko-Kamchatka who actually go and are wiped out in this period. Kind of the relatives of the Navajo and the Apache who had stayed in Asia rather than migrating across to Alaska. They get wiped out at that time by the ancestors of the people who would eventually become the Inuit and the Eskimo. So this is actually a reason some people believe that the Eskimo-Aleut languages of North America are related to the Chukotko-Kamchatka or the Yukagir languages of Asia. Again, I'm not a linguist. I'm not really qualified to say, but I think it's certainly possible. Similarly in the West, you have this expansion of, kind of this new circumpolar cultural tradition. And I believe this is associated with the Sami people. You start to see new arrowheads, these new cultural items that appear in kind of the early second millennium, maybe about 1800, BC in the Kola Peninsula. What happened, it looks like, is the Sami people, the ancestors of the modern day Sami, did adopt this part of the toolkit. Probably not directly from the peoples of Siberia, the Yukagirs or the Chukchis, but probably via the Samietic peoples like the Naganasan peoples. For the Sami, we actually can look at the toponyms, and we can see that the Mezhin River of kind of northern Russia was their eastern limit. That's where we have the oldest, I should say the most eastward Sami toponyms. Sami are also known as the Laplanders. There are people of, you can still meet them in kind of northern Finland and northern Norway. And the Sami, most likely, they kind of were there, in the Mezhin River Basin, and they migrated west with the advantage of this new Arctic toolkit. And they were able to overcome the remnants of the eastern hunter-gatherers in the Pechora River Basin, as well as the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers who lived up in the, kind of northern Scandinavia. It does look like they went and mixed with them somewhat. The Sami samples we have from Great Reindeer Island, and kind of an island off the coast of the Kola Peninsula in modern-day Russia. It's about 40% of this kind of Uralic ancestry. And that's in about 1500 BC. And the rest of the ancestry would have been from, the peoples they would have assimilated during their migration west. So it wasn't, total destruction. It does look like they did mix with at least some of these peoples. My guess is there were probably a bunch of different groups that were wandering around, because one of the features even today that you see of the very far north is you do have a lot of genetic diversity within these peoples, since they can adapt for these very different ecologies that others aren't as easily able to adapt to, in the way that, say, like a farming culture could adapt to a lot of different farming areas. Although, that's kind of an oversimplification of farming ecology, of course. So this is the first kind of very noticeable population replacement level Uralic migration that we see west. The Seima-Turbino people, I'm sure they were, kind of penetrating to the west too. I don't think they made as much of an impact, at least not by this point. So when we're kind of at the late Bronze Age, kind of the 1500 to 1200 BC, it looks like we have the Uralic languages that are spoken in western Siberia, possibly as far east as the Minnesota Basin, and maybe the Sayan and Altai Mountains as well. They probably furthest east you go is into the Yenisei, where they start to go and meet like the Yukagirs and the other groups. And then in the west of the Urals, you have them in the Pechora Basin, you have them in the Mezhin Basin, all the way to the Kola Peninsula and northern Scandinavia. And to the south of them, you have the Indo-European peoples. The Indo-Europeans had ruled the area for the previous, 1,000 to 1,500 years, depending on which area you're referring to. Um, I think Gotland was one of the last areas they conquered, perhaps around 2400 BC. Although Gotland's kind of difficult to say just because, when you're dealing with islands and radiocarbon dating, it can mess with the, calibration. So it's more difficult to get accurate dates for kind of islands and coastal areas and rivers than it is from inland areas. Um, but it looks like Gotland might have been kind of the last holdout of, one of these, peoples in the Baltic at least. So the Bronze Age collapse is this great cataclysm that happens roughly around 1200 BC. And there's actually a very, very good book that I think you would all enjoy called 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed by Eric Klein. He goes and he focuses pretty much entirely on the Eastern Mediterranean. You have, Egypt, Mycenaean Greece, you have the Hittites, all those peoples of Syria, Elam and Iran, and Mesopotamia. And his argument is that you have this kind of world war that's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean, and you have these sea peoples, the sea pirates, who we believe to be now the Mycenaean Greeks specifically, or at least a branch of them, that kind of started this, series of naval invasions that cut the trade routes, and civilization largely collapsed in the Eastern Mediterranean, with it just holding on in Egypt by a thread. From what we can tell, the Eastern Mediterranean was just part of the Bronze Age collapse. It was actually really, really bad. The population of Britain, I believe, doesn't recover for 1,000 years. You have evidence, a lot of fortification in the Eastern Baltic, around that time as well. You've got all sorts of cultural changes. In the Don River Basin, as well as parts of the Ural Mountains, you see the resurrection of metal, or not metal, bone and stone tool working. People lost access to metals. What it looks like happened was the Eastern Mediterranean was the center of the world by that point. Egypt was probably the wealthiest country in the entire Western Hemisphere. And again, this is a lot of this stuff, it's difficult to say. We just have the best records from Egypt. So that's, that presumably clouds our judgment. What we know from classical sources, though, like the Roman Empire, is that the Roman Empire got about a third of its state revenue was from international trade, mostly through the Indian Ocean. And, perhaps another fifth of its revenue came from using Egypt, its province, as virtually a plantation, where they would just directly administer the state. Now, ancient states were probably more robust than the Roman Empire. The Romans had advantages of huge, kind of scales of economy. Now, other states, they probably didn't rely on, half the revenue as, ruling others as plantations or on trade, but trade would have definitely played a major role in their economy. So having, even like a decline of, say, 20%, that you're getting from trade with other chiefdoms and other kingdoms and realms and tribes would have, put a crimp in a lot of their, ability to finance their state apparatus, to buy off their vassals, to fund their armies. And that could have started this kind of chain reaction that would have ended a lot of these countries. And that's what it looks like exactly what happened all over Europe and the western half of Eurasia. The Amber Road was a pretty major trade route. It went from kind of the amber fields of the southern Baltic that connected down the Vistula, through the Danube, and then from the Danube into the Black Sea, from the Black Sea through the Straits of the Bosphorus. That's kind of the sea between Asiatic and European Turkey, into the Eastern Mediterranean. That's just one trade route that we know about because amber keeps well. There were undoubtedly other trade routes. That was just one of them. And, presumably amber, it had been, even going back to the 5th millennium, an export from the southern Baltic. So, the end of that kind of export industry to the wealthier societies of the Middle East would have definitely put a crimp in the finances of the Baltic chiefdoms. And this is where the Uralics come in. So, as we, and actually a lot of other peoples, the Proto-Germanic peoples, it looks like, also started to migrate out of their original home in Scandinavia into modern-day Poland and northern Germany, in this kind of 400-year period between 1200 BC and 800 BC, but that's for another talk. So the Uralic peoples we have to the west, we have what's called the Anninino culture, and to the east we have the Itkul culture. And you have, going back to that kind of advanced metallurgical tradition that we have for the Uralic peoples, going back to the Seima-Turbino, we also see that with the Itkul and the Anninino people as well, because they have access to all these mines in the Ural Mountains. So, they've got these locally supplied metals, and they aren't as reliant on the, kind of sea trade routes for their metal imports and exports as others are. I don't think it's a coincidence that we see this massive expansion of the Anninino culture in this kind of 400-year period. At the same time that we have the Bronze Age collapse. I believe their Indo-European neighbors to the west had lost access to the metals that they used to sustain their countries. And as a result, you have these kind of more robust Uralic peoples who aren't as reliant. Obviously, land trade is much more expensive than sea trade. So, the Uralic peoples being able to maintain their societies with, let me rephrase that. So the Uralic peoples, they could maintain their societies with less than what the Indo-European peoples to their west could. And this is a pattern that we actually see repeated in the migration period in the 5th and 6th centuries AD, where kind of the more robust Germanic and Slavic and Celtic peoples kind of take over large parts of what used to be the Roman Empire, which was a very, had a lot of economies of scale and was more fragile than these migrating tribes. I think it's very similar to what we see with the Uralics. You have the ancestors of the Permian peoples, the Komi and the Udmurts, who go and settle kind of the middle Volga and the Kama River. You have the Mari a bit further west, the ancestors of the Mordvins to the southwest, then going all the way to the west, you eventually have the Estonians, the Livonians, and the Finns, who go and settle kind of the Baltic, or the Eastern Baltic, I should say. And you see all the Anninino sites pop up, by 800 BC or so. And that's likely the kind of ancestors of the, kind of Finno-Permic peoples. To the east, it's a bit more confusing. So that's kind of, we start to see in the 9th century, there's all, you have the appearance of the Y chromosomal haplogroup N1C. That's the haplogroup of CRA001 that we talked about earlier. That's very common in the Uralic peoples. And, that's why I believe we can date the Uralic expansion to the Bronze Age collapse of 1200 to 800 BC. The depth of the conquest definitely varied in different areas. There's some areas like Finland, Finnish people are perhaps maybe 5% Proto-Uralic in ancestry, give or take a few percentage points. The Estonians are very similar. Whereas further east, when we get to the Udmurts, who are kind of along with the Komi, are kind of just west of the Ural Mountains, there may be about a third kind of Uralic in ancestry. They can be modeled as about kind of a third Proto-Uralic in ancestry, and, maybe 2/3 or a little bit more of their, kind of the preceding Indo-European Srubnaya people before them. What it looks like, it was kind of, especially in the far west in Finland and Estonia, it was an elite replacement where you had this heavily armed ruling class that set themselves up as the chieftains, ruling over these Indo-European speaking peasants. It was a bit more complicated than that due to the way the Baltic worked. But it was very different from the Sami to the far north, where they did go and replace quite a bit of the ancestry and the peoples of kind of the circumpolar peoples. And a lot of that had to do with just the different modes of productions. When the Sami migrated, they had a totally different mode of production. They had, kind of the Arctic toolkit. The Arctic's a very harsh environment. You can't really support, slaves, serfs as well up there. You definitely had to have a freer culture in a lot of ways, binded by people who wanted to work together. Whereas you could definitely have more coercion in a kind of agro-pastoral society, which is what we see to the south. The Andi peoples, they did practice kind of a mixed agro-pastoralism. One of the big things they would do is they would convert, they'd use forests as kind of pig farms. They would herd their pigs around, these forests, let them graze, and then just kill the pig when they wanted pork to eat. The average person probably owned, maybe, 20 to 30 farm animals. So the average family, would have had maybe 80 to 100. It's hard to say, but that's about how many you'd need to keep the herd around and be able to feed yourself. Depending on the area, there were some that would have definitely adapted fishing, gone more farming. The Udmurt sites are, the ones I'm most familiar with since I actually visited there. Now, in the very beginning, it looks like there was some sort of political unity between the Uralic peoples, at least in the West, I should say, maybe they were vaguely organized into a loose confederation. They might have had maybe it was one single family that dominated and set up kind of their sublords who would, rule over different areas. It's hard to say. I think the interesting part, though, is that the early fortifications from the Andi people for the first few centuries are actually all in the south. They're not, you wouldn't, and this is kind of the 800 to 600 BC period. You have all of them that are built kind of on the steppe. So kind of northern Russia, the way that it's set up is it's very heavily forested. And then to the south, like once you get, it's called the forest line. Once you get below the south, you have the steppe. And the reason the Uralic peoples, they only really colonized the forest area. They did not colonize the steppe. Even though the Sargat people were probably Ugrian, possibly Proto-Hungarian people, they were much further to the southeast. The Uralic peoples were really not that great of horsemen, at least at this point. And it was the Iranian peoples, the ancestors, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Ossetians, all those guys, who actually ruled the steppe, basically all of southern Russia and the Ukraine, for hundreds and hundreds of years. Probably going all the way back to maybe 2200 BC, all the way up until the Hun showed up, within the historical period. So the Uralics only really colonized kind of this forested area because they didn't, their tactics, their better metal weapons gave them an advantage over their rivals. And, they definitely did fear these horsemen, and with good reason. The Sarmatians actually took over some of the ancestors of the Udmurt people in kind of the lower Kama River basin and, middle Volga area, I believe around 300 BC. Might have been the Scythians, but they definitely took over part of the ancestors of the Udmurt people, and whether they or not they installed a ruling class or whether it was partial replacement, it's difficult to say. I would be really interested in DNA testing a lot of the remains they have from that period. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So after a few hundred years of the kind of big Uralic expansion, and really it's the Finnic and Permian peoples, the Finnic peoples being the Estonians and the Finns, and then you have the Permic peoples, the Udmurts, and the Komi people of Komi Republic in Russia, and the Udmurts are from Udmurtia. You start to see fragmentation. You have forts that aren't built on the steppe. You start to see them built within kind of the Andi culture, and then you start to see more cultural differentiation. The Anu culture was definitely a Bronze Age society, even though it technically took place in the Iron Age. And you start to see a transition over to iron, around 400 AD, and that's when it's replaced by the piano board culture. The piano board culture, it does look like it was a natural evolution out of the Anu culture, at least in kind of the Kama area, and that's where you start to see bronze is pretty much totally replaced by metal, by iron working, I should say. Iron had, there were some advantages to iron, some disadvantages. I think one of the reasons it took a while was because there were some issues with the distribution of metal around. Let me pull up the exact quote. I'm citing Lyudmila Kryakova and Andrei Epimahov's excellent Cambridge World Archaeology book in here. And actually, I was wrong. It was around 200 BC that the shift from the Anu Nino to the Pianabor culture took place in the Kama. And that's when That's when you do see the shift from kind of the mixed iron and bronze working to pretty much total iron working. And the Pianabor culture is kind of the Proto-Permian culture. The ancestors of the Komi, as well as the Udmurt people. Further to the west, where you have kind of the Finnic peoples, they covered the area, all the way to Moscow. They had a lot of contacts with the Baltic peoples. The Baltic peoples actually expanded north at some point in either the classical or almost certainly the classical period, actually, because the Lithuanians actually have quite a bit of the Y haplogroup N1C. Again, very much like the Estonians, they have very little, maybe 3-4% Uralic ancestry. But they still have quite a large percentage of their men have the N1C haplogroup. So what it looks like happened is the Lithuanians are kind of like a Balticized, they might not have been entirely there's a couple different things that could happen. They could have been an Uralic-speaking people and then re-Balticized to speaking a Baltic language. They could have been, perhaps they were conquered by an Uralic ruling class that was just too small and just eventually decided to adopt the language of the local Baltic speakers rather than forcing them to all speak the Uralic language. It's difficult to say for sure, but something happened and they definitely did experience that kind of Finno-Ugrian invasion and the Bronze Age collapse as well. And then what else? Going back to the piano bore, the Udmurts, I'm looking back at Kryakova's book right now. It was the 2nd century AD, actually, that the Sarmatians invaded them. So kind of at the same time, you have, the Romans are invading Dacia, or Dacia, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. You have the Sarmatians are going and invading the Udmurts and setting themselves up as a ruling class of the Udmurt people. And interestingly, the Udmurts are very interesting to go and meet. They're the most redheaded people in the world. Like if you walk down the streets of Izhevsk, which is, I believe, about a 20% Udmurt city, and then 20% Tatar and, about 60% Russian. Probably about 1 in 10 people there have red hair, and they're you'll see kind of a couple different types. You'll have some people that look almost like they're Irish. They're extremely fair-skinned. They have kind of the red hair. And then you'll get some more like interesting looks. Like you'll have people with very fair skin, except they'll have kind of high cheekbones like Amerindians. And kind of the more slanted Asiatic eyes. But then they'll also have, like colored eyes and, red or blonde hair or something. It's just a very interesting people and how they formed. So that's just kind of a, Udmurtia is great. Strongly recommend you guys check it out, especially if you're Russian and it's not too much. Now, for the going into the modern period, or I should say the historical period, for a lot of the Uralic peoples, you do have. I'm almost certain that there was it is certain that there was a lot of subsequent admixture between the different Uralic and Indo-European groups. Russians from kind of the far north, around the, you know, um, Dvina River and the Pechora are noticeably more Finnish than other Russians. You know, some of them look like they might have had, the equivalent of like a kind of Finnic grandparent, if not more, or a Sami grandparent. I should say Sami specifically. Um, Within Finland itself, there was a lot of, there still is actually a lot of heterogeneity. In the Ostrobothnia state of Finland, they have, I believe, four burials from the, if I recall correctly, the 6th century AD, that is. And three of the samples are actually very similar to modern Sami people. There's actually a lot of Sami toponyms that indicated that they did rule Ostrobothnia. However, one of the, the fourth sample that was there was very similar to, modern day Swedish people. So whether that means that, in my belief is that the Finnish people did colonize kind of the southern part of modern day Finland, and gradually, due to relatively more cultural sophistication, ended up expanding north and, pushing the Sami people out from kind of central Finland into the far north. Even though there was undoubtedly a lot of admixture. There's similar stuff like in Estonia. The Estonians, even into the medieval age, were known as notorious sea pirates, where they would go and take captives. So they were presumably enslaving a lot of Vikings and whatnot. That's actually a trend that goes pretty far back in kind of the Uralic prehistory. During the period when the Indo-Iranian peoples were, kind of the ancestors of, or I should say, the partial ancestors of the modern Indians and Iranians, were living up in Siberia. The more advanced metalworking Finno-Ugrian or Uralic peoples actually were enslaving with them. The root for the word slave in most of the Uralic languages, excepting Samietic, is Arya, which is what the eastern branch of the Indo-Europeans, or the Indo-Iranians, I think is the preferred word, called themselves, at least at that point. So it's definitely a long trend for the forest people with the more advanced metal weapons to, conquer and enslave the Indo-European and steppe agropastoral peoples to their south and absorb them. So that's all. And then there's more stuff too, like in the, I know there's references to the Mansi people, going and raiding kind of Russian settlements, in the West and taking slaves that way as well. So the average Mansi today is probably, a lot more Slavic in ancestry than they would have been, 1,000 years ago. For other Uralic peoples, it's a little bit different, like the Udmurts, for instance, probably have more Slavic ancestry now because you had these traders from Novgorod that would kind of go and, conquer different areas, intermarry with the Udmurt and Komi peoples, just so they could get access to their furs. Very similar to how the Métis people of Canada formed, where you have these kind of French fur trappers intermarrying with Cree women, just as part of their, trapping duties for the fur industry. So I know that was a lot of material to cover. I know a lot of it's very hypothetical, and of course all of this stuff could, change if there's new findings. Do you guys have any questions, comments? I mean, am I wrong about this stuff? I know I have a couple actual geneticists in here, and I'll open this up